also media coverage. We also know that state media is a mouthpiece of one political party, one or two, at the expense of other political parties throughout the electoral cycle. And we are saying from SADC's point of view, can we say these elections were free and fair? From our point of view, we feel they were not rigging occurred. It was a process which occurred throughout the electoral cycle. I think.
We came a month ago to observe these elections. Now, if there are riggings with respect to the legislation articles in the Zimbabwe Constitution, that is up to yourselves to work it out. But as far as my mission is concerned, we went to the ground to observe the elections, pertaining and in respect of the guiding principles of SADC observer missions.
The issue of the voters' roll is very central to an election. There were, from the AU, saying that there were ghost votes. It wasn't people that shouldn't have been on the voters' roll. What is your impressions of the voters' roll? And the second question, what does this mean to the SADC mediation team? Is this the end?
And with respect to the voters' roll, as it was said, that of course the concern was there was a delayed delivery of the hard copies and electronic copies of the voters' roll.
With the 2 days to go to an election, I, as a presidential candidate, do not have a voters' roll. As we speak, our chief election agent, Morgan Committee, is in police custody as a result of incompetence of ZEC. We are not aware as a party who is printing the ballots, where, how many are being printed.
We witnessed a very violent 2008 election in Zimbabwe, but this time around we've seen some maturity among its political players, where there were very few incidents of physical violence. Of course, we can't rule out intimidation. We've also noted that there was intimidation from the remainder of the 2008 elections, but overall it was peaceful. So it is important that for elections to be accepted, at least the needs also to be peaceful, not to be prone by violence.
I also want to thank the other parties, big and small, the MDCs and their leaders, for what was a joint exercise, a joint appeal to our nation for peace, for a fair and violence-free campaign.
On election day, urban voters were further systematically disenfranchised. At 82% of urban polling stations, many potential voters were turned away and not permitted to vote for reasons which include names not appearing on the voters' roll and turning up at the wrong ward for voting. This is in sharp contrast to rural areas where only 38% of polling stations turned away many potential voters.
Things can appear to be very peaceful and calm on election day, but we need to look at the entire electoral process, the pre-election period, election day, and particularly how the post-election day period is handled before we come out and say something like that. We believe that it is premature and that we should wait and see how the processes turn out. We have highlighted certain areas where we believe that the credibility of the process has been undermined.
It has been peaceful. There hasn't been any violence around here. But the problem is the queue is not moving. I hope if the queue can move, then everybody will be able to vote.
Shure yangu iri mungoshure kuti dai tatangovhotawo mune zvakadi mune zvakanaka. Ndiri kuona hapana problem. Mara inawo marefu asi tikuvhota hedu mune zvakanaka hapana chandiri kuona chakaipa.
ZESNI calls on the African Union, the Southern African Development Community, to be objective in their evaluation of these elections and take into cognizance the pre-election issues that have a bearing on the ability of citizens to genuinely choose their government. We reiterate that it is not sufficient for elections to be peaceful, for elections to be credible, they must offer all eligible citizens a reasonable opportunity to register to vote, to inform themselves about the candidates, to vote on election day, and for their votes to be properly counted.
There was no one who could give us a figure, and therefore I cannot comment on thousands of voters turned away, because there was nobody who could come up with a concrete figure, and therefore we cannot really comment on something which was not verifiable. There was nobody who could give a verifiable figure, and therefore from what we have observed, we are indicating that despite the problems with the voters register, we are indicating that we believe, from what we have observed, that a fair and credible process was rolled out by ZEC.
For a very long time, the people of Zimbabwe have been shortchanged in the manner in which the elections have been conducted in this country. So, atibirwi futhi. Vakatibira 2002 presidential election, Mugabe akabira 2008. We have got a very clear message. Yamuru kuumba nasi. Don't dare do it again.
The so-called public broadcaster and the state-controlled print media can only be described as a disgrace in the run-up to the elections, particularly over the last few weeks. Not only has the coverage been one-sided and a total violation of the Constitution and the electoral laws, but Reportage has been replete with outright falsehoods, hate speech, and inciting language and content.
Our national broadcaster and national newspapers, instead of operating as public entities which give fair and equal access to everyone who is competing in this election, have basically been operating as if they are propaganda mouthpieces for ZANU-PF. We know that our political actors learned their lessons from 2008 and know that violence will cost them legitimacy, both locally and also in the international community of states. So we were relatively convinced that they would stay away from the violent path, and we're happy that they have done that. What we have been more worried about is manipulation of the electoral process.
What other element can contribute to free and fair election than peace, tranquility, no violence, a non-violent environment? It contributes greatly to the freeness and fairness of the election.
You said it was free and peaceful, but was it fair? And was it a level playing field, given the concerns of stakeholders going into the election?
We have said this election was free. Indeed, it was very free, peaceful. Indeed, it was very, very peaceful. And the questioner wanted to know, we did not say it was fair. It's simply because in the report that will come, because the question of fairness is broad and you cannot answer it within one day. And so be sure that within 30 days of our main report, the question of fairness may come.
The voters' roll, there is no country really who can claim to have a perfect voters' roll. It does not exist. So in our recommendations, definitely we would need to indicate that there's a need to clean up the voters' roll, because there's no country that has a perfect voters' roll.
We, as the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, acknowledge the atmosphere of calm and peace which has characterized the harmonized elections, but would want to caution the nation that judging the elections by the atmosphere of peace and calm or as a single factor might mislead us, as we have noted quite a number of challenges that would have, could have a negative impact on the entire electoral process. ZESNI calls on the African Union, the Southern African Development Community, to be objective in their evaluation of these elections and take into cognizance the pre-election issues that have a bearing on the ability of citizens to genuinely choose their government. We reiterate that it is not sufficient for elections to be peaceful. For elections to be credible, they must offer all eligible citizens a reasonable opportunity to register to vote, to inform themselves about the candidates, to vote on election day, and for their votes to be properly counted. Based on the empirical reports from our observers, the credibility of the 2013 harmonized elections is seriously compromised by a systematic effort to disenfranchise urban voters up to 1 million. Before election day, the voter registration process was systematically biased against urban voters. The voters' roll of 19 June, as provided by the Office of the Registrar General, clearly showed that urban voters had systematically been denied the opportunity to register to vote. A total of 99.97% of rural voters were registered, while only 67.94% of urban voters were registered. Over 750,000 urban voters were missing on the voters' roll compared to rural voters. In contravention of the law, the final voters' roll was not made available in electronic format prior to election day. Thus, there's no way to assess any bias on the final voters' roll.
Shalako, I'll soon get the ground.